are just under 1 month out from the release of one of the biggest video games of the year, and unfortunately, yet again, I want to talk about video game crunch with, this time, a very good friend of mine, Christo Aivalis, a political YouTuber with a PhD in labor history, a video game lover, and a fellow Canuck. Christo, thank you so much for joining me to talk a little bit about the state of labor in video games.
Thanks for having me.
So have you been following at all the kind of meteoric rise of the Cyberpunk 2077 game?
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, I was a fan of the Witcher game, Witcher 3 in particular, and I generally like these, open world RPG type games, whether, the Elder Scrolls and what have you. So, just as a fan of video games, I've been very excited for this game, and also, I've sort of been, following the discourse around crunch, whether it's about this game, but also even here in Canada with Ubisoft and other studios. They've gone through recent controversies with crunch over the last couple of years. So, when I heard that, they would not be doing crunch, but then sort of backtracked on that decision, I mean, I was disappointed, but not necessarily surprised, because most major projects seem to go through a crunch period.
Yeah, so you're referring to there the initial assessment from the CEO, I think last year, of CD Projekt Red, saying to Drachen Schreier, who's advocated and investigated crunch in the video game industry for years now, that they're planning a system that will ensure no crunch for their workers, whether or not it was through changing allocation of resources, what have you. And then a little while ago, we were able to find out that unfortunately they are reneging on that initial bargain, and no, there will be 6-day work weeks in, at the very least, the last month. And this actually goes in line with some of the earlier information from people who have left CG Projekt Red that have accused the company being a culture of blame, that it really seemed to be of who you know in order to get ahead. And the interesting criticism here is that CD Projekt Red is, in many ways, kind of the darling of the video game industry. You mentioned Ubisoft before. There has always been a little bit of residual hate towards Ubisoft, just even for some of the choices they made in their game design, EA, those sort of things. But CD Projekt Red could do no wrong. And now that they have been identified of doing some wrong here, there is a big backlash of people unhappy with this addition to the experience of Cyberpunk, the little sprinkling of crunch that happened behind it. And so much so that there is, in fact, a new report from the Game Informer podcast that I think really expertly conveys a position in the crunch conversation that I want to talk about today. So here's a clip from a recent Game Informer podcast.
Everyone I've talked to that's over there has not seen it as a crunch. And from what I'm understanding is that it wasn't just a random drop of this is now mandatory. From what I understand is there was a discussion beforehand about weighing the different options. Did I talk to every single person at CD Projekt Red? No. But there's another important part of this that I really feel like doesn't get addressed, and especially with a lot of those like kind of not clickbait, but like deliberately inflammatory headlines, is that it's I don't know. I'm kind of
it's a complicated issue.
It's a complicated issue, and the fact that the day that they went gold, the conversation came back in flux. And I've talked to a couple of the devs that said they were like so excited to share people the news that it was gold. And one person directly told me, she was like, I'm almost scared to sound proud of what we did. She's like, I'm scared of what people are going to say if I say I'm proud of the work we did. And you shouldn't be scared to say what you've done. And this thing has been in production for how long? You earned the right to be proud of what you did. You earned the right. Do you feel burnt out? Do you feel taken advantage of? And she said no. And I'm like, then be proud, like be excited, celebrate this, pop open the champagne and freaking celebrate, because there's a time and a place, to talk about these conversations, and you can have these very important conversations without completely taking a crap on the entire effort that went into these games, because crunch, the burst of production and productivity It's not new. It needs to be heavily monitored, but the conversation should not overtake everything.
So in no means does one statement indicate one's position for life. You know, I've had a chance to speak to some of the people who were on that podcast that admit that it's nuanced and complicated, but that idea that there is a time and a place to discuss crunch, I think reads a little bit like both sidesism. What do you think about that, Christo?
Yeah, I mean, I often think that whether it's about this or many other political issues, you know, locally or globally, that, you know, often an argument against actually talking about them at all is to suggest now in particular is not the time. Whenever there's a tragedy in the United States, for instance, often the argument will be, well, we can't talk about it right now because to talk about it right now would be a disservice to those and their loved ones affected by the tragedy, and it's politicizing it and trying to be opportunistic. Yet often the precise time to talk about something when you want to affect that change is when people are actually focused on the issue at hand. And that might well mean that this is the precise time to talk about crunch culture when, a major studio that made a promise to not do it has reneged on that promise and is now doing it. And this is the time to talk about it, not 6 months from now when the game is out and the discourse around that culture has subsided. Now is the time to talk about it. And I understand that it's not the only story, of course, but it is a key one. And this is the moment to really center it in the discourse, because it's, you know, a game about to come out. And historically in gaming culture, in the gaming workplace, you know, the last few weeks or months of a game before release are usually mired by this hyper intense crunch period of work, which causes many, you know, emotional, mental, physical issues with a lot of the workers in those industries.
Yeah, it is really upsetting to believe that you care so much about the video game industry, because I believe absolutely truly that the people talking there have a love and devotion for this industry as a whole and the people working in it. I think that it is a very insidious position, though, to advocate that we shouldn't be talking about this because now it's time to celebrate. There's a time and a place for it. And the biggest issue that I have with that, before we get into more of the specifics and maybe how to adequately deal with crunch, is that position allows the average consumer that wants to be a part of the culture an opportunity to care just a little bit less about these human rights abuses, which is what they are for the people that are working in these positions. It gives you as the consumer an opportunity to enjoy the product without this little asterisk. And I get it. I understand the need for that, because we said here before, you know, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. So it's very difficult to just always be stuck in that mire of having the weight of everything you do and the moral implications of it. And these people are giving us an out to say, you know, these developers aren't feeling pride on the release. So now we have another emotional reason to maybe disregard some of the claims that were brought up previous about crunch, because look, this is the emotions of the developers now. If you really cared about the developers, why would you take this away from them? And for me, like I said before, a claim like that is more damaging and insidious than someone who, you know, maybe is more right wing that adopts a position. These people get paid $100,000 a year in some cases. You know, they should be working hard. I work at a job, I get paid half that, and I have to work 15-hour days most days. So why should they get any special treatment? That position of just deliberate otherism is something you can kind of tell and you can understand. This position that we're hearing today, though, that you need to help them celebrate and let's just all calm down, I think is more pervasive. I think a lot of people think this way. And I think it's really damaging because, like you said, Christo, if we don't take the opportunity now when people are excited to have a critical lens of what this type of workplace procedure does for the people working there. When are we going to do it? When are we going to try to make this analysis?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I think the challenge is that this viewpoint does allow, in a sense, people to, I guess, almost use context as a tool to sort of sidestep the story. And there's nothing wrong with a journalist or a reporter or a commentator looking at multiple perspectives, and if anything, it's the right thing to do. But there are times where, you see a story, it's a clear story of injustice, and that's what crunch culture is. And trying to find all these like nooks and crannies, a few anecdotes here, suggesting that maybe this was a decision that the workers supported there. These sorts of things which maybe can be cast as, well, actually the story is more quote unquote complicated than it's being reported on by certain, aspects or certain elements of the gaming industry, when in reality all they're doing is sort of leaving a reader with, less sense of what's happening, and as a manner to get the person to say, well, I don't really know what's happening here. I guess I can't really know. I guess I'll just have to assume that both sides have a point, that both sides are right and wrong, and I'll leave it at that. And that's a great way that somebody could, hypothetically at least, really neutralize an important story without taking a position directly against it. And I think that that's something that I think we have to be, I guess, vigilant for. And sometimes it's not even always a conscious effort by the person, but in doing a story where, you develop all this context, but don't actually still drill down to the fact that there is a correct or incorrect way to view this story. And the correct way is crunch culture is wrong, even if some workers, engage in it quasi-voluntarily, at least within their own mindset, and suggesting otherwise, I think, is problematic.
Yeah, no, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, of that the intention by a lot of these people with this position of, we just need to celebrate, it's a time and a place, isn't necessarily not even malicious, but intended to undermine. But when it's presented in this way, it kind of negates the previous information that was set up. So I think that in this case, that's what's happening. I don't think it's intentional. People are just trying to fill out other information. But information, especially when it comes to ones relating to previous reporting, doesn't have value unless it's attributed, in my opinion at least, to a moral understanding of the issue. Or, like you said, Christo, it just muddies the waters. And one of the issues that I think really muddied the water in this latest reporting was the idea that they kind of came to a collective decision, that this Polish studio asked the people working there and that they agreed to go back to a 6-day work week. Now, there was some indication earlier that CD Projekt Red does have a 10% profit share after the fact with their games, which is, I guess, great, but still doesn't, ameliorate the issues. In terms of that, workers voting on something together, in your experience looking at kind of collectivism in workplaces and that statement, how true, how freeing is a worker able to dissent in that situation based on what you've, researched and looked at?
Well, I mean, my view is that this is at least somewhat a false choice. I mean, certainly if true, because again, maybe it was a quasi demand, but in reality, or it was a quasi ask, but in reality, management was demanding it. I was, of course, not in the room, but in the sense that workers are being given a choice, it is better than simply being told by decree. But outside of like a formalized process where demands are made and people are allowed to, have significant time and independence to think of the decision, it wouldn't surprise me that more than a few workers might go along with the crowd on the issue, even though they have reservations, personal, professional, what have you, with the overwork. Maybe they feel that it's taking time away from their families. Maybe they feel the crunch will lower the quality of their work. They might get the work done faster, but working that 6th day, that extra few hours, means that the average quality of every hour will drop, and they have concerns in that regard. And there's no real way to voice that in such a context. And I think that what this shows me is that it's just another reason why, unionization is needed in this industry. And often, there are a lot of perceptions about unions that are rooted in a historical conception of what people think of unions, which is that they represent a predominantly blue-collar workforce in a highly automated and regimented industry, like, let's say, an assembly line worker. But in reality, unions have been designed and modeled, at least in the recent decades, off workplaces that are far more similar to, video game studios, where you're dealing with white-collar professionals that allow flexibility both individually and collectively. And I think that, for instance, I've seen lots of collective agreements, in say, the academia or in the administrative side of universities, where my wife has done some work in union representation, where there's a full recognition that there are some periods of the year, whether it's because students are back or whether it's because your department has a big event, where you'll have to work many hours that week. You might have to work 6 days that week. You might have to put 50 hours in instead of 35, 40 hours in that week. But there are procedures about how that's determined, procedures about how the extra compensation will be paid to you, whether it's in money or in increased vacation time. And it's set up in a manner to acknowledge the needs of flexibility in the workplace, which I get, because if there are issues with your product, you might need to work on the fly. But it allows workers a formalized process to understand how that's implemented. And currently, in a non-unionized environment, even if you could just gather everyone in a room to have a quick up or down vote, do you want to do the crunch period? I don't know if that's going to get an accurate representation, whereas in a collectively bargained process, there's a clear, from the outset, from the start of a project, you'll know if we ever do something that's akin to crunch, here's why it'll happen, and here's how it'll work, and here are the disincentives to the employer to do it, whether it's overtime pay, whether it's more vacation time, whether in this case, for example, it could be if you force crunch on us, we get 15% profit share instead of 10. These are things that could be demanded and give the workers more say and a greater sense of security about how crunch will be implemented, if at all.
I think in the video game development case, unionization would really work to help developers almost fight against themselves and their own inclinations. We talk about creative industries a lot, and this story of crunch and whether developers are happy to do it has been going through the wires today, as they say. And it's interesting to hear from a lot of developers that said that they weren't even really aware that they were implementing crunch for themselves and their colleagues, because there is, in many cases, such a shared love of making games that much better. A video game is always going to be an unfinished product. There will always be more that you can do to perfect it. So for people that are involved in the creative process, being creative can be something that is never ending. So having a formal structure that is above yourself, even your creative indulgences, is important because it stops us from pushing ourselves and others to a point creatively that will, if given time, will never end. If CD Projekt Red had 10 more years to make Cyberpunk 2077, they would use that time and the game would be that much better. But understanding the limitations we need to place on ourselves as a creative industry, I think is really important, because there is this idea of hype and this idea of almost the magic of video game development. And the comments that we heard by Game Informer, I think, really feed into that cultural issue. For me, it's the thing I need to fight the most against in the video game industry, because so much of what is created is wonderful and magical, and it does things that I don't think other mediums can do. But recognizing that it's created by people that work the same sort of jobs that anyone else who has a job works is a line that I don't think a lot of people who love video games always bring themselves down to earth with, because it allows them, in my opinion at least, to get super excited about a thing to the point of forgetting the human hands that are involved. So that, beyond, collective bargaining and the needs of that, and making sure there isn't crunch, trying to save this industry from eating itself and creating these things that are impossible to finish is really what I am looking for the most. And again, why I feel like the thoughts by Game Informer are that insidious, because it feeds the notion that these issues aren't as important as the hype around a game. And if you really cared about the hype of the game, listen to these anecdotal things of developers. This isn't the time to talk about this. But like we said, the time and place is right now to talk about crunch. And I don't think we'll get another opportunity once this game comes out and it's amazing. So, Christo, if we did really want to push this idea of fighting crunch, we talked about just trying to get some unionization. The steps to make that happen, though, are, at least in my case of being in media and in radio, almost seem like an impossible task to get started.
Well, I mean, a couple things there. I think you're right in noting that, in a sense, whether it's the workers themselves or whether it's the consumers, there is this, idealization of certain types of work. And I think whether we're talking about, say, journalism or academics or even video game creators and other artists, or frankly even a lot of those of us on YouTube, there's a sense that the work is special, the work is somewhat at least disconnected from the grind of a traditional quote unquote job. And I think that often blinds consumers to the realities of what's happening, but also blinds the workers themselves. And I mean, if you look in academia, so many people are overworked and undercompensated. And it's all sort of tolerated by those people and by everyone else, because there's a sense that the work has this value, that the work itself is fulfilling, and it creates this sort of context. And I definitely think that it is a great privilege to do a lot of these things. It's incredibly privileged to be able to, work on things that feed your passion, but that shouldn't come at the expense of, your basic rights. And I think one thing to note here is that in the video game industry, as well as many other, under-unionized industries, a good chunk of them, the issues are far less bread and butter than in other industries. And I think that's important to realize. When we talk about unionizing, say, service workers at a McDonald's, I mean, a big part of it is, those people need more money. They just need more money to survive. But in other industries, it may well be the case that the compensation isn't at core the issue. Maybe it's not commensurate to the work being done. But, if you earn, say, in the low six figures, you might have a comfortable life. But the issues for you are work-life balance, nepotism in the workplace, harassment in the workplace, discrimination in the workplace. The issues might be trying to find a balance between individuality and setting baselines in the workplace. And, one thing I think is that unions do need to do a better job at selling a model of unionization that works in these industries. And you are seeing growing success at unionizing white-collar workers in the United States and Canada, at least, because these workers have been often sheltered historically from the ravages of neoliberalism, but not anymore, right? Not anymore. These jobs are being outsourced. They're being deregulated, like a lot of, blue-collar and pink-collar working-class people have faced since the 70s or 80s, and it's now hitting software developers and academics and lawyers and all sorts of other people. And more of them are looking to unionization. But I think you have to sell that vision of unionization that recognizes the type of industry. And I think, for instance, like you can look to a collective agreement for an auto worker and where the salaries are very quickly determined and very rigidly determined by service and by those sorts of things. And I've heard people in, tech style industry suggest, well, we want, something that recognizes our individual achievements. But of course, if you look at the collective agreements of most university faculty associations, they more work to set baselines in salary, vacation, protections for workers, but they also allow for merit pay, and they also allow for bonuses based on productivity and things like that. And I think that these are the sorts of industries that need that collectivism, but don't necessarily need it to fundamentally change the style of work they do. And I think that that's a model of unionization that I can think would be quite successful, because the way a union works in a GM factory will not be the way it works at CD Projekt Red or at Ubisoft or what have you. But a union, the way it works in, faculty associations might be rather transferable. And I think that, that's something that needs to be looked at.
Well, that is fascinating.
In terms of how it gets done, I mean, there's challenges, right? I mean, with CD Projekt Red in particular, neither of us are experts on Polish labor law, right? So I don't know the process of union formation in Poland.
Christo, that's why I wanted you here. I thought that was what...
But, here in Canada, I mean, and in the United States, there are barriers to forming unions. In the United States, they have right to work legislation, which can make it rather difficult. And in both Canada and the United States, the lack of card check certification means that there, even if you get a majority of workers to express a desire to form a union, there's a crucial window in which a quote-unquote secret ballot vote can be, demanded, and that might seem democratic, but really it's just a last gasp window for the employer to disincentivize unionization. So there are lots of issues here. But I do think that one of the things that the labor movement has to do is to build a unionism that works for these workers. Because again, going back, and I'm not going to make this a history lesson, it used to be that all the unions were like the guild-style unions, where you were like an electrician or a plumber or a butcher or a baker or a candlestick maker. And like you had a guild, right? Like, and your union set the terms of your employment as you sold your labor on a piecemeal basis. But that didn't work for the big factories being built in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And so they invented a new kind of unionism, which was like, we have 30,000 guys at this plant. They all basically do the same thing. We can have a one-size-fits-all collective agreement. But that's not going to work for video game industries. And so you need to meet people where they are and find what's a collective bargaining regime going to look like for people in the gaming industry. And it might not be one size fits all. What works for QA people might be different than what works for developers.
And there's so many different sizes too when it comes to video game development firms and publishing units. It's such a multifaceted business. I really loved what you're talking about of trying to change the conversation of what unionization can represent, that it doesn't have to be the same for GM factories as it is for CD Projekt Red. Culturally, though, for the people that celebrate these video game industries, I think that one of the biggest steps is removing that sense of hype that admittedly the video game publishers and developers tried to cultivate in order to get us obsessed with these franchises and create, this brand loyalty that is on the risk of being damaging. But addressing that, Christo, I think is a really big first step, just to make sure that the information that you're saying doesn't fall on deaf ears, specifically to the video game industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? Because, I mean, you get excited for things. I mean, I get hyped for certain video games, maybe not as much as I did when I was a bit younger, but I'm still like, I'm a gamer, right? And I do get hyped for video games. And I think, as you note, like, it is something that really it's a medium that's kind of unlike no other. I mean, there are parallels to television and other things, but it really is something special. And I think it's about letting people be aware of the nature of the industry and like the costs of that hype. You're not going to get rid of it fully. And again, I think you have to be tactical about it and reasonable about it. One, as you note, the line, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, meaning that, we all have to live our lives. We have to be able to enjoy things. But also, you don't want to turn your movement for social justice into something that can be seen accurately or not, fairly or not, as just buzzkill.
Yes.
Like, you don't want to make your fight for justice be seen as being a buzzkill.
I think, Christo, that is one of the biggest issues right now for people trying to talk about, workers' rights in the video game industry, is the idea that as a consumer, because this is such a consumption-based relationship when it comes to video games, the limits of what we can do have a lot to do with that false dichotomy of whether or not you pay for games or celebrate them, whether or not you're going to buy the product that is this video game. And if you ever have any advocacy against that because of these injustices, the idea of being labeled as a buzzkill is always a part of the conversation. So I would love to know, because I don't think the answer in the video game industry, not buying the game, I don't think that ever necessarily works in most cases, but specifically the video game industry, I think it really doesn't work. I would love, and again, we're not going to solve it right now, but how do we try to advocate for workers' rights and, people seeing video game industries as workplaces while not being a buzzkill to the magical ending products that we get?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think calls for boycotts should be rare. Yeah. Like, for me, one thing I would always boycott is if I don't support scab labor. So if a developer was unionized and then had workers on strike and then produced a project with scab labor, I wouldn't do it. Like, for instance, last year when the public tech workers at the Toronto FC soccer team at the stadium, at the exhibition grounds, were on strike. My wife and I had tickets to the soccer game, but refused to cross the picket line because to do so would be relying on scab labor. So that would be a hard line for me, and I have no issue being a buzzkill in that context. But I think it's clear here that crunch culture is not ideal, but it's not necessarily a call to boycott the work. Yeah. And I think what you should note here, and what we could note here, is that, us criticizing crunch culture isn't trying to make workers feel ashamed for their work. We're not calling for a boycott, at least you and I aren't.
Yeah,
we're not calling for people to not play the game.
I'm talking over you there, but I think that is so essential. I think it needs to be highlighted even more, that discussions of this are not meant to stop the enthusiasm of those making games. It's specifically because there is a love and celebration. I go back to, this isn't the time or the place. It is a time or the place for the same reasons that the people at Game Informer feel compelled to worry about the pride of these developers in the criticisms of the reporting around crunch culture. The same feelings that they have, an inclination of protecting that, is, I think, we're coming from the same place, that we care so much about the developers and the work that they do that I don't want to take away from their accomplishments. I want to celebrate it and not have to deal with that same ethical quandary. I want to all be on the same side. So sorry, please continue.
Yeah, no, but I think kind of on that point, I think you could say various things for instance, if we all recognize crunch as not ideal, it's not necessarily even just from a labor perspective, but as I've noted, rushed work is rarely the best work, right? Yeah. And I think there is something to be said for, crunch culture potentially, at least, leading to these issues. And I think one of the things we've seen in modern game development is games get shipped out and they're not done yet.
Yeah.
Right? They're not done. Games are often shipped and they're not done. And they're full of bugs and they're not very fun to play at the beginning. And it's maybe they should have just taken some more time, right? And I think that if there's anybody spitting on the quality of the work of the developers in those cases who put so much work into the writing and art design and systems and all those sorts of things. It's a corporation that needs to rush out the artistic product for shareholders or to hit the Christmas window or what have you. And that's what takes what might be an otherwise brilliant project, which is turned into a consumer product, and the artistic value is ruined. And that's not necessarily allowing the developers to take pride in their work because it's being rushed. You might also suggest that, we can say it's not time to talk about crunch period because we want the workers to take pride in it. But there's been more than a few times that, crunch has been used as a tool to wring out the last bits of labor from your workforce before laying them all off right after the game comes out.
Even if it's not that direct, it's the developers that go through these crunch cycles and they say you can maybe do 3-4 games and then you have to leave the industry. So if you care about this industry as a whole and don't want to have that brain drain, we need to covet and hold these little developers a little bit like baby birds, like we all are, because it is tough out there to work in these sort of environments. So I think that for me, coming to this from a position of empathy is always going to be vital when dealing with labor issues and creative issues. But specifically, I don't think that Cyberpunk 2077 should be boycotted. I don't think that it should.
No, I'm definitely going to play the game.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think
it's going to be great. I'm sure.
Trying to highlight those injustices that maybe some of the workers had, and in your criticism of it or acknowledgement of it, analyze certain aspects. Like maybe they didn't need to crunch so hard to make sure that, the physics on the dog's balls was specifically the most realistic. Also looking at these works and trying to parse, where we as a consumer maybe don't need it as much to that same level is, for me, I think a more operative way of trying to criticize this huge cultural issue of crunch than just boycotting and being like, no, poo-poo, don't forget this game had bad people doing bad things, but trying to be more critical, have a critical eye and relate that and just be more aware, I think ultimately will work so much better than just saying, I don't want to talk about it. Let's just celebrate,
Yeah, no, agreed. 100%.
All right. So thank you very much, Chris. You said agreed, so I thought that would be a good time just to end it while I was set up. So I guess, ultimately, there are different positions here. We've identified one thing that is kind of unique to the creative industry is the idea of hype and the culture of people pushing themselves for the work itself and the consumers who also embrace that kind of culture. So I love a lot of the stuff you talked about of how this needs to be different, how unionization is not what we typically think. Like we said, we have some ideas about how to address the issues of what that hype does to people. Any kind of closing thoughts just to people that maybe have been listening, got this way through, and still really aren't convinced on the need for unionization for these video games that they just love so much.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that if we want to allow workers to take pride in their work, or if we want to take pride in them, you have to not just look at the final product, but the process that goes into it. And not just the labor process, but like the emotional process. And I think that the best way you could take pride in an industry is to know that not only are the final products fantastic, and again, I think this game's going to be great. I'm excited for it personally. But to know that, every step of the way, whether it's in compensation, work-life balance, maybe, more democratic input from the workers, that everyone felt good making this product. And I think that that's something that I don't know if we can fully say about an industry yet that like this. And I think that's what we have to get towards. And that's how you really allow workers and everyone else to take pride in these products.
There we go. Thank you so much again, Christo Aivalis, political YouTuber, PhD labor history. You can find him online if you are looking for any of those leftist takes on the news of the day on YouTube. And he and I actually are in the works of kind of making something a little bit special. We're starting a new project, a weekly podcast, providing kind of a leftist Canadian perspective, how the country works and the goings on there. So please check it out. The links to what I mentioned here will be there on the description. That's the word I'm looking for. Christo, thank you so much.
Thanks again.
And finally, I do want to hear from you. If you are gritting your teeth through this entire thing, if you listened for this long and are just furious and want to spew hate, please do so below. Or if, you've listened and think, this is not how unions thought, please, I want to hear from you. But those are the only two sides I want to hear from. Nothing else. Mandy Burkowski for VGS.